Two. All right, I want to take you to Toronto now and introduce you to Chris Alexander. He was Canada's Minister of Citizenship and Immigration from 2013 to 2015. He spent 18 years in Canada's Foreign Service, and he served abroad in places like Moscow, and then he became, I think, Canada's youngest ambassador in Kabul, Afghanistan. You were the youngest ambassador, Chris, is that right?
I guess I was the youngest one at the time, yeah, but there have been other people before and since.
Well, you still look youthful despite serving in a tough place, So good on you. Look, let's talk about Afghanistan, because you spent years there, not only as the ambassador, but you were also there with the UN. Do you believe in this so-called peace process?
I believe in a peace process, absolutely. And we worked for it, Dana, as Canadians, and then in the UN mission for all my time there. We wanted to bring the two sides to the table. We wanted to end the conflict, but we wanted to do it under a constitution and a rule of law and a political system that Afghans had chosen. And we wanted to do it in a way that ended violence. And I would say that both of those conditions are now in doubt, the way the peace process has gone over the last 10 years, and particularly in the last year, as this desperate effort, I would call it, by Ambassador Khalilzad, who's moved forward to sit down with the Taliban at any cost, even as they continue to engage in violence on an alarming scale.
Well, Ambassador Khalilzad is being driven by President Trump, who wants to fly the flag, it seems, and say, I'm bringing the troops home. I mean, there aren't that many there to begin with, but he wants to say, for election purposes, by November, he's going to bring them all home, or maybe leave 2,500 there into next year. And it seems like that's very short horizon politics, given the tremendous cost that America has had on the ground, in Canada too. Canadian troops were in there as part of ISAF and the NATO element, but this tremendous cost that the Americans have paid, even in blood, being in Afghanistan since 2001.
Yeah, I mean, Trump doesn't care about the outcome for Afghans. He cares only about saving his own skin politically and doing the right thing from a very superficial populist standpoint. He's bought into this rhetoric of forever wars, that we could never win. He's an isolationist, and he's anti-NATO. He's anti-alliance. He doesn't think, well, he thinks the U.S. should have a huge military budget. He doesn't think the U.S. should do anything with its soft and hard power to make the world a safer place for everyone. And so it's a disaster. His rush for the exit without any binding obligation on the part of the Taliban to end the violence. And so they haven't ended the violence.
And that's really put even his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a very uncomfortable position, right? Because they have said that any withdrawal of American forces will be condition-based, meaning end the violence, and I want to ask you about that, end your ties with Al-Qaeda, and that's where all of this started after 9/11. And then all of a sudden, Trump came out and said, we're gonna be bringing them home by Christmas. And then General Mark Milley had to kind of say, well, wait a moment, this is condition based, and we'll see if the Taliban meet these conditions of stopping the violence. I mean, so there is a contradiction between what the president of the United States is saying and what his chairman of the Joint Chiefs is saying.
Correct. But let's be clear, this issue of military people insisting a heavier footprint was required and presidents resisting has a long history. I mean, even in George W. Bush's time, the brass were calling for a larger commitment. The White House resisted because Iraq was their priority, disastrously. Then under Obama, who came into office promising a surge, he made the surge conditional on starting to pull troops out almost immediately, which most military leaders didn't agree with. And now Trump has taken it further. I mean, here, the real issue, Dana, is very simple as far as I'm concerned. yes, a military commitment is still needed. Yes, NATO needs to be there, principally in a training role. Yes, the Afghans need to be enabled to defend their own country, but they will only succeed and we will only be on a path to peace when someone somewhere does something about the fact that the neighboring country, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, bankrolls the Taliban, harbors the Taliban, arms the Taliban, funds the Taliban, trains the Taliban, and sends them across the border to destabilize, undermine, and lay waste to a neighboring country.
But you
That
really
is
make it sound,
unacceptable.
Chris, like the Taliban's completely behind, that Pakistan is completely behind the Taliban. And I
They
mean, a lot of
are.
people would say that they gave them safe haven or allowed them to exist in the
No, Dana,
frontier
that is
area. Are you
wrong.
saying it went much further
It
in
still
that
goes
than that?
much, much further. Why, when Khalilzad is worried about getting the Taliban to the table, does he go bleeding cap in hand to the chief of the army staff in Pakistan? Why do they have to bring him to Kabul uh, and roll out the red carpet and serve him tea on a silver platter to try and get even the Taliban to show up in Doha? It's because Pakistan controls all of the cards as long as the international community is completely inconsistent in its insistence on pressuring the Afghans to negotiate peace while their neighboring country wants to make war. Listen, Russia invaded Ukraine, we sanctioned them. Iran is waging war in 3 or 4 countries. Most countries have sanctioned them for that. China has shut down democracy in Hong Kong. We are all changing our relations with China as a result. Pakistan invades Afghanistan every day via the Taliban, has fought NATO for 10 years via the Taliban, and there are no sanctions whatsoever against these people. That is
Well, in fact, we
what,
were giving a lot of
what I
money to
call
The
policy
Americans
failure.
were giving a lot of money to Pakistan.
Well, we've cut back on the money, and they are at least being questioned about their state sponsorship of terrorism through the Financial Action Task Force and a few other venues. But there's been no concerted effort to come to grips with Pakistan's role in fueling this conflict. And as long as as we ignore that, this conflict will continue.
Why is Iran now supporting the Taliban as well? Traditionally, they were, um, not arm in arm with the Taliban. Now there are a lot of reports that Iran, as well as Pakistan, as well as Russia, have their fingers in Afghanistan, but Iran specifically because they believe that the Taliban will push back ISIS, which has a foothold in a number of provinces.
No, but let's be honest. Iran will maintain relations with any group that is prepared to challenge the United States, particularly with violence. They hosted the leadership of Al Qaeda partly after 9/11. They have had their own relations with ISIS in the Middle East and elsewhere when they needed to, when it suited them. And with the Taliban, they've always, ever since the Taliban began their comeback in earnest in 2006, they've always had their finger in the pie, but it's a much smaller share of the support than Pakistan has.
They're
And I
stirring a
don't think
lot
we should
less
let
trouble there
ourselves
than
be
Pakistan
distracted by
has.
that. I
Indeed,
mean,
indeed.
they like the Taliban because they're on an upswing in Afghanistan and they're anti-American. They do not like generally violent Sunni extremists who have fought them in Iraq, Baluchistan, and elsewhere.
So, Chris, let's roll the clock back a little bit, because there's a generation of people don't understand what the hell we're doing in Afghanistan anyway. But I mean, originally the Taliban were asked to cut their ties with Osama bin Laden after 9/11 and to cut all its ties with Al Qaeda and essentially give up Al Qaeda. And they refused. Mullah Omar refused in Kandahar, and then the invasion began after that under President George Bush. Now the UN has come out in June and said that the Taliban retained close ties to Al Qaeda despite an agreement with America that Washington hoped would see Afghan militants turn their backs on the terrorist group, according to the United Nations monitors. So after all of this fighting to oust Al Qaeda and make sure that Afghanistan's not being used as a base for terrorist attacks all over the world, suddenly the UN, and you were part of the UN, you tell me if you consider that to be a credible report, are saying that the Taliban are maintaining those ties with Al Qaeda.
I have always fought the people in the UN and elsewhere who thought that the idea of breaking Taliban ties with Al Qaeda and with terrorism was feasible. It's not. The Taliban is a terrorist group. The Haqqani organization within the Taliban has been a virulently terrorist group, killing civilians at an alarming rate for a decade now in Afghanistan and more. They have received a huge amount of funding from Pakistan's ISI precisely because of their capacity to mete out violence indiscriminately. So it's no surprise that all of these people have links to Al Qaeda, that Osama bin Laden, after 9/11, after the US operation began in Afghanistan, took refuge in Pakistan and was there for over a decade, living in comfort near Abbottabad as a guest of the Pakistani government. And anyone who thinks that that is not the case, that Pakistan was tough on Al Qaeda and not on the Taliban, that Pakistan doesn't really want terrorists to be based on their country, should have their heads examined, because the facts are completely otherwise. And the fact that there isn't investigative journalism left and right, backwards and forwards, covering all of this is amazing to me. I mean, think of Steve Call's book on the S directorate of the ISI about their involvement in Afghanistan. This is a guy who wrote Ghost Wars in the wake of, and had great success in the wake of 9/11 with it, basically downplaying Pakistan's involvement. Now, over a decade later, he published the book saying, oh, it's all Pakistan's fault, and no one pays attention.
If you're calling...
So how do we expect to have any success in the world when we haven't told the truth about what's happening?
You sound angry. And
I am angry.
Is that because, I mean, Canadians also policed some of the toughest terrain in southern Afghanistan, and many Canadians...
I'm sad for the families of Canadians who lost their lives there or who were injured there, who've come back with PTSD. The only way you can justify those sacrifices is by being able to say we were on the right path and we got a result. We're not on the right path and we won't get a result. And there are thousands more Americans who lost their lives, thousands more from other NATO countries. And Dana, most of all, there are tens of thousands of Afghans who lost their lives, as well as hundreds of thousands, millions who live in fear in a fragile, in some respects, failed state because we haven't gotten the job done.
Most Afghans, I mean, when I entered Afghanistan right after 9/11. I was one of the first journalists across the border from Tajikistan. Most Afghans that I met wanted the Americans to push the Taliban out. They had had enough of them. And for kids to go back to school,
they did. The economy and they expected the Taliban would not come back. They did not anticipate that Pakistan would help them mount this comeback, which they have done. And they certainly didn't expect that the United States and other allies would, when Pakistan did this, pretend it wasn't happening.
So are we making a mistake by talking to them? Because you're calling them a terrorist organization.
We shouldn't bother talking to the Taliban. We should talk to Pakistan and we should say, you drop these guys, you drop the fight in Afghanistan, or we sanction the hell out of you.
All right, well, the ISI, which is the intelligence agency of Pakistan, and isn't about to create that kind of peaceful playing field, I think, but maybe sanctions, maybe there is an argument for sanctions.
It doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter at all what they think. This is what they're doing. And the consequences for any other country would be sanctions and international isolation. We should be consistent and bring the same principles to the table with them that we bring to any other state that is causing trouble on this scale. And it's incomprehensible to me why we haven't done it yet.
A lot of people would say that Chris Alexander's paints a very bleak picture that unless you talk to the Taliban, this fighting is endless. And we've already got 20 years of it.
Yeah. The Taliban do not call the shots. Ask anyone who knows the organization. Their bosses are in general headquarters, in ISI headquarters. They do not take decisions autonomously. They never have. This is what a proxy war is, Dana. And yeah, you can keep carrying water for Pakistan and saying, oh, you have to talk to the Taliban, they're their own people. But that's actually bullshit.
Where does this end now? If America pulls most of its troops out, or they go down to numbers that are so small that they won't be able to carry any kind of counter-terrorism out in
In a worst
Afghanistan
case scenario,
anymore.
it ends with a US withdrawal and a Taliban takeover.
You think we're
And
really heading
Pakistan
back to that?
being delighted that they
Unbelievable.
have pulled this off.
Unbelievable. If they go back to that, it will be a massive failure.
It will be our failure.
Chris Alexander, good to talk to you again. Always great to see you. And, you know, folks, there's not very many people who have the knowledge that Chris has in Afghanistan. He spent a lot of time on the ground. So it's an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks, Dana. All the best.